Well, there was an older one,
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's Friday. Welcome. There you go. Okay. Let's get going then. Hey, Kathleen. Okay. They're not well? Remote. She's remote. Somebody's looking for her. The not well applies here. This governs everything that we do at the IETF. If you're not familiar with this, please make sure you get familiar with this. It's important. Let me mute myself here first. And please, there's something still. Yeah. I'm getting feedback. You getting feedback? Yeah. Hello? Yeah. So, see, I muted myself. Yeah, it is muted. Yeah. Hello? Yeah, better. Sorry, technical difficulties. Make sure you're familiar with the not well. Please be respectful and professional with your colleagues here. It's showing the slides content. It's not working? Justin, what is it?
That's why I was texting Nina instead of interrupting you.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Meeting tips, please make sure you sign to Meet Echo to allow us to kind of know how many people attend, so we plan properly for next meetings, and also to allow you to join the queue. And if you're remote, please make sure to turn off your audio and video unless you want to speak. Okay, we talked about the updates. We want to go to the agenda. This is our Friday's agenda. There you go. Brian will start with talking about SDJOT and SDJOT VC. Then Mike and Brian will entertain us about JOT profile. Peter will be talking about transaction token. And Brian will be talking about OAuth identity chaining, right? Brian, right? Okay. And then Justin will be talking about the deferred key binding for OAuth. And last, Nick. Welcome, Nick. Here he is. Welcome, Nick. He will be talking about OAuth spec additions, extensions, ideas. So that's our agenda. Any comments, questions, bashing? If not, let's get going. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Let me give this to you. You should be able to draw. Okay. And you have 10 minutes for this, right?
Yeah. Hopefully faster.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Fat. Jonas. Everyone, welcome to the last day. I threatened not to do this presentation in the last session, but we're not quite there, so you get to listen to me talk for a few minutes again about selective disclosure for JWTs or SDJOT. We'll make it quick though. So usually try to give a little bit of context or intro for the tourists in the session or so forth, but we're so near the very end of this. I'm gonna make it super quick. And a quick shot of something for tourists to be aware of. This is a $35 glass of juice I got last time we were here in Bangkok. So nice view, but the juice was expensive. SDJOT is a relatively simple salted hash-based mechanism facilitating the selective disclosure of individual elements of a JSON encoded data structure used as the JWS payload. The primary use case really is selective disclosure of JWT claims. Since we last met in Dublin, It is working. My eyes just aren't good enough to see it. It is a problem. Well, I need to do something about that, but not right now. We've published 2 revisions since Dublin. Can't make out the numbers. I think 15 and 17.
16 was very short.
Oh, yes, maybe 3 revisions, 15, 16, and 17. 15 was after the second working group last call. Really, there's some minor stuff in here. It seems minor. It was a lot of work to kind of reconcile and get to what we wanted to say, but made some more conscientious adjustments to the privacy considerations, addressed an AD review before you normally have the AD review of comments resulting from a formal review, a formal appeal of the document that was taken to the AD. The AD reviewed the whole document, trying to respond to the appeal comments, and that resulted in a number of changes to the document itself, although they were all editorial in nature. And further clarified language around compromised or coerced verifiers. This dates back into the privacy considerations. Again, these are nice, important changes, but nothing really majorly impactful in the document. We found ourselves a document shepherd. Thank you, Hannes, for taking the shepherding work and doing a nice detailed review in a nice tight time frame. I also included a picture of Hannes and our AD here the last meeting when we were starting to look for that shepherd. And of course, Rafat sitting in front of me in a more comfortable seat on the plane over here. He was not at the last meeting, but I wanted to include him in the slide anyway. And of course, John and Nat from the classic thing. In 16 and 17, more of the same kind of stuff. Hannes, thanks again for the review. Updated commentary from Hannes into one of those. Additional fixes, I think it was on 17. Some other changes based on some feedback received at a later stage review and some updates in the acknowledgement section. Thanks to Rafat for this picture of me looking happy after I got upgraded. Now, not actually upgraded, but just upgraded to a slightly better boarding zone on the flight over here. But anyway, zone 3 hopefully rhymes with RFC. The document is in...
On all of that despite the MAGA hat too, right? So.
If...
I feel like you might want to clarify.
Yeah, that's slander.
There has been a request off mic for clarification, which I will do. Thank you. That is a red hat for the Denver East High School Angels, where I went to high school, where 2 of my children go to high school now. It is red. It is most definitely not a MAGA hat.
Oh, we are relieved.
Thank you for your...
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you for your question, though, Tim. We shouldn't have politics here, but we do have these. Yeah, so it's an AD evaluation. I've been promised a review soon. Thank you, Deb, for doing that. I'm also on vacation next week, so looking forward to responding to that review post-vacation. And with that, next steps are hopefully you'll never, ever have to hear me talk about this again. And as they say in some sports team about something, trust the process. That's Bangkok from the last time we were here. That was less than 10 minutes, I think.
Awesome. Yeah.
Question, comments?
Hi. First of all, thanks for, the nonstop, work on this document. It's been a long time. As part of the review that I was asked to do as an SDCOT editor, I wrote a little section for the intro, like a section 1.3, and I sent that to the list. So if anybody thinks that that's useful, please let the authors know. Let me know. Let the church know. I don't know. But if nobody says anything, then I'm not going to say anything. But if people think that it's useful, then I think it would be nice to get it added to the document, and I would be happy to create a PR. But I'm not going to create a PR unless there's someone else or like a reasonable number of other people who think that it is useful. Thank you.
That particular piece of content, I thought it was a nice intent of what we are trying to help people read through and understand it. As I was looking at it, there's, I thought some introductory text that was nice, was a bit repetitive with some of the other stuff. And then you got into the examples, which to me felt like they were more verbose than I wanted to have in that section. And some other text that was somewhat not inaccurate, but repetitive, and touched on some areas where we've had some misunderstanding previously around the number of disclosures that were or were not allowed, basically whether or not a zero length disclosure list was allowed or not. And it didn't say anything wrong, but it struck me as it may be an opportunity to introduce additional confusion around and against text that was already there and normatively specified. So that was part of my reasoning for not incorporating it. But again, if others are believe that would be worthwhile, we're happy to look at it. But we are, trying to move things along at this stage as well.
Okay, good. Anybody else? Any comments? Okay, let's get going. Next one. Deb?
It's a ways.
It's all the way this way. So that review was in February, right? Is that part of the original?
That was part of the Shepherd.
Oh, so it's on the list.
It's on the list, was during when I wrote up
Was
the
during your
Shepherd
Shepherd
write-up.
review? All
Yeah.
right, so I can find it.
Yeah, it's on the list. Round about the same time as Hannes's. All right.
Right.
Am I free to go? And so close on the heels of that is SD-JOT-based verifiable credentials, SD-JOT VC for short. Another photograph of Bangkok from the last time we were here. It was a lot less hazy and or less polluted last time we were here, which is unfortunate for a number of reasons. But
Oh, hold on.
oh,
Every time I need to
okay.
hand
Hand
you
it
that
to-
thing. Yeah.
and it's-
Yeah, it is. No. It works. It's just neat.
now it's working. Yeah.
Every time you change the slides, I need to hand it again to you.
Okay, again, try to set a little context, but not too much. It's always a balancing act, but SD-JOT VC is a data format as well as validation and processing rules intended to express verifiable credentials with JSON payloads with and without selected disclosure, building on top of the SD-JOT format. We also have come to start calling them digital credentials, or thanks to them, verifiable digital credentials. It's all very confusing, but they're all largely synonymous for each other. Uses SD-JOT and the well-established JOT content and extensibility model as the basis for representing these VCs or DCs or VDCs. I can't. The document also describes an issuer metadata format and key resolution. It's basically a way to look at the issuer in the SD-JOT and go to the web and find signing keys for it, as well as a mechanism to how to pull verification keys from an embedded certificate chain in the header. Describes some type metadata, which is not the issuer describing the thing, but a generalized way of describing typing and display information for the document itself. It explicitly does not utilize the W3C verifiable credential data model 1.1 or 2.0, but it does not prohibit any such content within. So some things that have happened after IETF 121, we enacted the Dublin Accord, or at least that's what I call it to make it sound important, which was the media type change. We published draft 6, 7, and 8. In Dublin, you may or may not have been there, but I talked for 90 minutes, and really all I got was this lousy t-shirt. pausing for a photograph with Justin. It was a long, drawn-out conversation, both in that group and for a number of months before. But this is the net result of the change, which was really just replacing the V with a D in the media type, a little bit of explanation about what the name means, and a touch of I don't know what the right word is, a note about the change, why it occurred in general terms, and the potential requirement to support both media types as a verifier, just for some transitional period to make sure things aren't breaking out right. We have some stage changes. We haven't gotten a lot done in the immediate recent history, but we have some stage changes ready for publication in 09 that haven't been actually pushed. 8 is the latest. One is just some terminology stuff about using this term SD.KB instead of SD.JOT with key binding JWT. As a, excuse me, sort of a terminology update that was introduced into the base document with some help from Richard Barnes, and bits and pieces of that are making its way through this sort of sub-document. Some more editorial changes. Document reasons for not using JSON pointer or JSON path in the type metadata language. Suggestion from Aaron that we did get in there a little bit later than we should have, but it's in there. Thanks for the suggestion, Aaron. And we also had an interim meeting on this very subject, this document. The smile I have here, I chose that specifically as sort of contrast to the burning sign here from Dublin, because it was a bit of a contentious topic and interim, but ultimately the result, at least through my eyes, having evaluated the whole meeting and some messages from our esteemed responsible AD, is that we need to, we tried to allow for some extension points in the document, but they weren't particularly well specified or clarified. So right now we have an open pull request, hopefully to slide into the stage changes for 09 soon, that takes what was not great wording around extensibility for issuer key resolution and validation, and tries to make them a little bit better and more explicit, and takes the specific example of did document resolution for key resolution and validation, and makes it an explicit example about how one would utilize this extensibility point in a concrete way. You don't need to read all the text, but it's there in pull request number 299. Again, that's not a lot of work after all the to and fro that went into it, but hopefully this is a meaningful, useful resolution for this going forward. Another proposal in that same section is we currently have these two different means describing how to take an SD.JOT VC and make sure that validate the signing key for it. One is via the JWT VC issuer metadata, which is basically a web-based online, you take the issuer, append some well-known stuff to it, go resolve some keys, and see if one of those validates against, is a key that can be used to validate the document itself. And the other is through embedded certificates, where the X5C header is used in the SD.JOT VC, and that basically conveys the verification key in there along with the certificate trust chain. And the current text is a little bit weird. It more or less implies that if both of these things are present, you have to check both of them, which was never the intent, but it certainly can read that way. There's been some concerns raised about the potential of sort of web squatting, or after the fact web squatting, picking up domains that may not be active, publishing verification keys, and then sort of spoofing issuers through that mechanism, when really you only ever intended for the X509 variant to be the sort of trust anchor. And so trying to resolve this, I think there was one other problem. there was maybe something else wrong with this, but in an attempt to address these, proposing that we take it and where the issuer URL, the issuer value is present and is an HTTPS URL, that implies that the public key can be resolved through the web-based mechanism. When it's an X509, X5C header, the public key can be obtained from the entity certificate. That's both what they say, but change it such that the issuer claim is not required, which it is now, but allowing then for deployments that want to only convey trust through the certificates to omit the issuer entirely. And that would remove the potential ambiguity for that sort of web squatting problem that is there, but still allow for both methods to be used in situations where that's desirable. There was a suggestion a while back that it was necessary and required to have both available in support of the EU ID wallet stuff. It's certainly less clear that that's needed anymore, and definitely not a strict requirement. So this provides a little bit more flexibility in which approach you want to deploy, allows for both, but doesn't sort of accidentally require both to be supported by a verifier in cases where you really don't want to allow for the web-based resolution method. And I keep forgetting something else I wanted to say. And make it clear that you only have to validate one, and I'm sorry. Yeah, generally this. I wish I could have phrased it better. I know there was one other thing I wanted to say that I forgot about, but that's the idea, is basically allow for issued to be issuer to be optional, allow for one, the other, or both, but don't require both. Yeah, that's the proposal. Sorry, I articulated that very poorly, but hopefully it conveys the idea. And that's all for today. I know it's a really packed agenda, and so I'm not going to take up a lot more. There's a lot more little to-do items on there, but this seemed relevant and important for today. I would be interested in feedback on that, particularly on the last two issues while we're here in the room. And yeah, I think there's a queue.
Hey, it's Rowan. Regarding the issuer, optional issuer thing, was the intention to is the intention to make it more efficient by not having issuer, or to avoid having a situation where you can't actually, you discover the issuer via the X5U, but you don't know what it is ahead of time?
It was to avoid the situation where we had previously that you always had to have an issuer, and when you were using X5C, you still had to have an issuer, and there were rules about matching the value of the issuer itself to the content of the certificates. There was concern, the subject of the entity certificate, there was concern around if you were really only wanting to do certificate-based trust in that context, that there was still implied that by including that issuer in the document, you had the possibility of verifiers going out to the web and pulling keys, and thus also the possibility that that web domain expired or was taken over by a malicious entity or something. And so you would have these documents out here with X509 based trust that are now verifiable through a maliciously controlled website through the keys.
Yeah. So in other words, if the issuer was something that implied, don't go and fetch this, but here's the name of it, that would be okay.
Yes.
But you don't want the semantics of go fetch this.
Yes. Don't want to allow for that to happen. That's right. Yes.
David.
Oh.
We can't hear you. You might be on mute.
Mute, Ito.
I'm sorry.
You wanna
Mute, exit.
try again, David?
He's probably
Okay,
completely
so
gone.
here's David. Oh,
It's a meet echo mistake.
Again,
okay.
he's probably not there to hear us.
Okay, so while David's trying to come back here, so as you know, the EU digital identity are waiting for those documents like the SDJOT and token list. So the other ones are kind of more advanced. So what's your feeling of this one? Like how far are we from getting this done? Like how many? Like how do you still have too many open issues to address? Like what's the status?
It's a really good question. Thank you for your question, Rafat. I don't know for sure. I feel like these are the two that I just brought up here are sort of the larger pressing issues right now. We have a lot of issues in the repository.
Okay.
Many of them, though, are not super important or substantial or even still relevant in any case. And we need to do a lot of work to reconcile that.
Okay.
Which is a lot of way of saying, I don't know for sure. I think we're close, but certainly not as close as the other two documents.
So I guess hopefully by Madrid we'll have a better view.
Hopefully, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we'll have a better view by then,
Okay.
for sure.
Okay.
What that view will look like is less certain.
Sounds good. Okay. Awesome.
All right.
Anybody else have any comments, questions? Is David back? Or maybe. No. Okay. Thank you. Mike. What is this? What am I doing? Okay.
So Brian, while the next deck is coming up, I need to personally know whether you were talking about salted hash with a salted rim on the juice glass on purpose.
No.
No? All right, well,
I'm sorry. I'm letting you down.
a kismet.
I think that was sugar too.
Ah,
Okay. Welcome, I'm Mike Jones. I will be doing this discussion with my friend Brian Campbell. And some of the slides were produced by Joseph Heenan, so he's present with us in parenthesis. We're going to be talking about an update to the RFC 7523 document, one of our early ones, which defined JOT tokens used at the authorization server for two purposes, plus some friends. Please pass control to the
shoot.
clicker.
We need to. Yeah. We need
All
a-
right,
a feature.
We come to you today as a result of an interesting new development in our OAuth world, which is we had some security researchers do an analysis of a spec related to one of our OAuth specs. And they found a new vulnerability. Now, we went through this 10 years ago with a different vulnerability, which resulted in the OAuth security workshop starting and whatnot. But here we are again. Much credit to PhD students to be working in the security area at University of Stuttgart. Some of us met them in Iceland a couple weeks ago. The OpenID Foundation, as its finishing specs, tries to do security analysis, including a formal proof of the correctness of the protocol. During the analysis of OpenID Federation, they found a vulnerability which was exploitable and in fact could be exploited in some ecosystems in practice. And in fact, it's a feature in the 7523 spec, the JOT assertion spec, not just in Federation, and a bunch of others, which I'll talk about. It even has a vulnerability number now. There's a detailed description at this blog post If you want to read about how the vulnerability works and understand the preconditions for exploiting it, go to town. They were recently presented at the OAUTH Security Workshop number 10 in Iceland. Brian captured the moment here for us. So let's look at some of the spec text that is related to the vulnerability. Private key JOT has this text in 7523 about the audience value. It must be a claim containing a value that identifies the authorization server as the intended audience. The token endpoint URL of the authorization server may be used as a value for the audience element, etc. OpenID Connect heretofore has been similar. It must verify that the audience is intended for the right place. The audience should be the URL of the token endpoint. And other specs do other things. Pushed authorization request requires support for the authorization server's issuer identifier as the audience, but also says you have to accept two other values as well. Brian notes at the bottom of the slide, sorry about this, but let's also blame Philippe. There's more specs using different audience values for the authorization server. The signed authorization request says it should be the AS issuer, but it's a lowercase should, it's not normative. So why are we talking about the audience? The attack consists of an attacker managing to get a token issued with an audience of the legitimate server, but sent to it. And one of the ways to do that is to say that, oh, well, my token endpoint is the legitimate token endpoint, but you never use it. You just use it as an attack. And again, I'm not going to explain the attack. It's intricate. There are some requirements to do the attack that some systems don't meet, which is good news. One of the base requirements is you have to have an ecosystem with multiple authorization servers. If there's only one, there's no way to have a second one to attack the legitimate one. And that you need to be using the same client ID across the different authorization servers rather than somehow baking that into it. But it turns out that FAPI2 ecosystems and FAPI1 ecosystems, the open finance API stuff, did by and large meet these requirements for exploitation. And so one of the things the OpenID Foundation did was proactively contact all the ecosystems that we were aware of that could be subject to the exploit. And they've since updated their code before we ever talked about this publicly. So a number of us met in Dublin in private and talked about this. The people that met were the OAUTH chairs, some of the editors of some of the related specs, and some of the chairs and editors of affected OpenID specs. So all people who were going to have to somehow be involved in working out a solution. We did, and we went over this in more detail in the interim meeting in January, and I'm not going to do it all here in the interest of time, but there was a solution that gained consensus. That is to use the issuer identifier as the audience value in tokens sent to the authorization server, and for there to be only one audience value in those tokens, which had not been the case across the board previously. The good news is a bunch of our more recent specs already kind of do this. It is the recommended solution by PAR. It's used by JAR. It's now used by FAPI2 Final. It's used by OpenID Federation. It's used in the OAuth issuer parameter RFC 9207. Now, another thing we get to blame Philippe for is he suggested that when we update 7523, we should also follow the current best practice of explicitly typing those JOT tokens. And so the draft which we adopted some weeks ago does include explicit typing for the private key JOT token, etc. The specs that we have touched or might touch are on this list. I won't read it all, but you'll see that 5 of them are OAuth specs. The core problem is in the way that 7523 was written, and everything else references that. And so we did create an RFC 7523 BIS spec that applies the new audience language to it. That was adopted. Thank you. Then quickly, some of the other OAuth specs that are touched by this. Currently, we do not have BIS documents for the others. Rather than we use the updates feature of RFCs. For instance, 7523 BIS updates 7521, the generic assertion spec, to tighten its audience language and do nothing else to it. We update 7522, the SAML assertion spec, to do the same thing. The OpenID Connect working group has published an updated OpenID Connect core, which will be part of Errata 3, which does the same thing. FAPI2 Final incorporates the fix. OpenID Federation incorporates the fix. And Brian will talk about this, but the signed request format uses the lowercase should. I don't know why Nat and John and I were sloppy about that. We were. And so it's possible for us to update that to the must in the normal way. PAR, we update it to only have the single audience value rather than a plethora of 3. The OAuth security BCP, as was talked about in the previous session, was not updated, even though that was discussed. Some of the security researchers came to you on video and are planning on doing an update to that using the BCP process. So now we're going to start asking questions. Editorially, we thought it was going to be easier both for the editors and for the readers to only have one document that applies this change uniformly to everything in the OAuth set of specs that are affected. Then there would be updates clauses for all but the one that's replaced. We could do full update documents for all of them. That is easier in some sense for readers to consume when you're done, but it's harder to review while you're working on it. So I don't know that we're going to take agenda time to answer that question here, but it's one that I would covet answers to on the list. There's a question which Brian is going to speak to, which is, do we consistently update the audience value for authorization server tokens across all of them, or do we only touch some of them? The way the document that was written, that was adopted is written, we update all of them. So the authorization server always just looks for, is the audience only my issuer identifier? And you know, it's the case that 7523 defined two tokens, the client authorization token and the assertion grant token. On one hand, the security researchers say that both are exploitable. It's harder to exploit the latter. You know, is SAML client authentication even used? We don't think so. And I'll proceed. So, change of presenters.
So here we have a photograph of Mike taking a photograph of the security researchers presenting this finding in a bit of a meta analogy about the whole thing. You might be somewhat unsurprised that while Mike and I have been working together on this and worked on a number of the underlying specifications underneath it, we have somewhat differing viewpoints about how the best, most expedient, and least problematic approach to solving it from a specification. It's a big word. It's not really, but specification standpoint is. So I'm going to kind of present a little bit of my perspective on things, starting with the meta analogy. One of the things that I think is important here, even though it's out of, is this. Let me start from the beginning because I'm out of sync here. In the notice itself, this security vulnerability was found and related to specifically the use of private key JOT, which is the JWT-based client authentication mechanism. That's what the entire finding, the entire paper is about. There are potential vulnerabilities involved in the authorization grant side of things, but they are fundamentally pretty different, both in how they manifest themselves and how they can be exploited. And they're harder to pull off. There's different ways of mitigating it. And they are, in many ways, a completely different class of issues. But it's definitely not related to client secret JWT, not explicitly related to authorization grants, JWT or SAML. And not implicating JAR at all, the signed authorization request. Even though these are things about assertions being sent to the authorization server, the particular vulnerability manifests itself strictly in client authentication on direct calls from client to server through the JWT-based client authentication mechanism. The important note from the security researcher is, even though we've talked a lot about what the authorization server can and maybe should do in the larger sphere of protecting against this, the actual fix lies on the client side. It has to be fixed on the client side. A server side change can help sort of flush out clients that are not misbehaving is probably too strong a word, that haven't been updated to the new functionality, but it alone won't address the vulnerability or protect the authorization server itself. The change has to happen on the client side. The server side fix only sort of helps flush out the larger ecosystems. So my suggestion is that we move fast and break fewer things. Generally speaking, my proposal is a targeted document focused specifically on addressing the issue at hand. which updates JWT-based client authentication and clearly says that the AS issuer identifier, as is required to be the sole audience, and introduces explicit typing, largely for the ability to monitor the situation from a from sort of an observability standpoint, a little bit different than we typically use explicit typing, which is a clear requirement around if it's not this type, it's unacceptable in this context. We might get there eventually with this, but it'll serve that purpose maybe longer term. But in the medium near term, what it does is it gives an explicit signal in the assertion that the client's sending that the authorization server can use to understand explicitly whether the client has been updated to the new functionality or not. So it's sort of like an observability and reporting mechanism to help with the transitionary period. I think this document should update SAML-based client authentication and just admit that nobody's used it, nobody's ever used it, and explicitly tell people never to do it going forward, so then it's not a problem. It would have the same issues if it was deployed and used in this way, but since it's not being used, it seems a lot easier to me to just say, okay, it's just, we're done. Don't ever do it. We don't even have to fix the security vulnerability because it's not real, but advise people, of course, never to do it because then they would have the problem. I'm suggesting that we update assertion-based authorization grants, both SAML and JWT. They are very similar. They are a way for a signed assertion issued in one sort of security domain to be conveyed cross-domain as a representation of that user's authorization in order to get an access token result. Update these and advise the client to ensure that the audience of the assertion makes sense with respect to where it's being sent. This is a little bit different than the harder requirements around the client-based authentication because it's almost always being issued by some authority, central authority on that initial trust domains world. And the way that systems are represented is less clear. In SAML, it might be a SAML entity identifier of the other party. It's very common. It's a little bit of a weird mix between specs and layers, but it happens in practice today. It's deployed that way. So restricting it to be an AS issuer identifier would effectively break existing deployments for no strong benefit in terms of added security. It's just sort of introducing additional churn and breakage into the marketplace. It might be the issuer identifier, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And it very well could be the token endpoint URL because that was, at the time of writing most of these things, the primary mechanism that we had to identify an authorization server. We didn't have issuer identifiers. We only had one endpoint that the client interacted with directly at the authorization server. So it is, in this context, a very reasonable value to use to identify the authorization server that you're calling. And by the way, I don't think I mentioned it here, but client authorization assertions, authorization grants, the terminology is still hard, I'm sorry, are only ever sent to the token endpoint URL at the authorization server. Much different than JWT-based client authentication, which over time has evolved, like all client authentication mechanisms, to be used at the token endpoint, the PAR endpoint, the revocation endpoint, others that I can't think of right now, et cetera, et cetera. That is effectively my high-level proposal for a targeted, less invasive solution at the spec level to the problem discovered by these security researchers. Notably, JAR isn't even on here because JAR is, yes, a signed JWT sent to the authorization server, but its context of use is wildly different. It travels through the front channel, where a big part of this security vulnerability was how you stole a client authentication assertion. It's kind of hard. You have to do some trickery, multiple authorization servers, metadata stuff. Stealing a jar signed authorization request is super easy. You just click on the button and anybody can do it. You just pause your browser and steal it directly from there. So like
Right.
both,
Sorry.
sorry,
We're
running out of time.
time. So,
All right.
so do you want to maybe wrap it up and
Yeah,
tell
let's
me
keep
what?
going.
Yeah.
The other thing is really I'm pushing for here is patch these documents rather than completely replace them. The approach that Mike's taken so far in 7523 bis is more or less to recreate the entire content of 7523 and apply the specific updates to it, as well as the updates to some of these other specs. That works, but what we're trying to change here, I think, is such a small portion of that larger document that it would be easier both for editors and consumers of this context to have one thing that just updates these various points and says explicitly what needs to be different. Yeah, context.
Which is what we did for all but one.
All but one, yes. But so it would sort of narrow down that to very targeted and also allow for easier treatment, piecing apart the audience treatment for authentication and authorization is hard in the way that this was done because of the way we treated it in the base documents. If we went with this sort of patch approach, we could just ignore that and say very explicitly, these are the differences, bam, and so forth. So next steps, that's my proposal. There's another proposal. Should we vote? I know we don't do that. Should we hum? We don't do that anymore. Anybody want to fight? This is me at Mai Tai a while ago. That's all for humor. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, time's up.
Yeah. Thank you.
minute.
I want to say one other sentence. It's always the case that you forget something in the slides that's important. When we talk to the ADs and Roman and the chairs in Dublin, they said fixing security vulnerabilities is important. We could move fast. There are ways, for instance, to jump to the head of the RFC editor queue and to get expedited review throughout the process. So we can do this very fast once there's consensus on how to do it.
Okay. Thank you, Mike and Brian. So,
Can I do one more thing?
yeah, sure.
Sorry. Another piece with the patch approach is facilitating that fastness by not introducing the opportunity for all of you, and me too, we all do it, to fix a bunch of other stuff while we're there. When you bring out the whole text of the document, there's this overwhelming desire to fix things. And trust me, there's a lot of things that could be fixed.
Yep.
Let's fix just what needs to be fixed. And also, we did discuss this with the security researchers, and they were on board with this idea.
Stop squeezing.
I'm squeezing. I'm sorry.
Okay. So what I want to do is I want to get a feeling of the room, or I'm going to ask a question about who read the draft. I want to know, we want to know as chairs, how many people actually read it and know what these gentlemen are talking about, okay?
Those
So-
are two questions.
No, so yeah, we'll start with the first one. If you read the document, and after that, no, hold on, take it easy. So I'm starting that now.
Oh, the poll thing.
Yes.
I hope you read it fine.
Yeah, I'm gonna say so.
Uh-oh.
Using IPv6 only. Using IPv6. Actually, I think my phone is using the Marriott.
Okay.
Who sent this? I read the draft.
Okay. Okay. I'm gonna stop it right now. We have 13 yes, 24 no, and no opinions 3. Okay. Yeah. So I think that. Yeah. I have no idea. Yeah. Okay. What I'm going to ask is, do you understand the difference between the two proposals? Okay.
the two proposals being a narrow
See, like, I'm not gonna say, you either understand or not.
Yeah, Ron, you would say no.
I was about to rephrase it, so then you could be the judge if I knew if it was no or not.
Okay. Okay.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, that is pretty good.
Wait till it's the end. To the end.
Your no opinion's gonna swamp us.
Okay, it's stable. It is stable. So I'm gonna stop it now. 1, 2, 3. We have 20 yes, 9 no, and 5 no opinion. That's really good, actually. Okay, so we run out of time, and
Ask which you prefer.
okay, yeah, that's a good point.
Ask
Okay.
if you can go forward with the proposal made by the draft authors.
Okay,
Is that okay?
say that again. Sorry.
Ask if it's okay to go forward with the proposal made by the draft authors. Yes or no?
Well, these
If
are two
everybody's-
different proposals. Okay, I'm gonna ask.
That's why he voted no.
I'm gonna ask who is in favor of Brian's proposal first. Actually, Mike's, because he started.
That's what's
this.
adopted.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
that's what.
Then okay, perfect. So then I'll ask about Brian's. Okay. Who is?
Are you?
Huh?
Are you?
Oh, are you? Are you? Yeah. In favor Brian's version. It's good. Okay, I started the poll.
No.
Someone who is new, Brian,
Say no opinion.
and the latter proposal for the
Yeah.
more narrow
Description.
Okay,
and not being given the chance.
you're not allowed. Okay.
It knows that you're Brian. It doesn't-
Okay, this is not an official, just a feeling. We'll have to take it to the list and make it official, okay? Anyway, for now, I see really lots of support for Brian's approach at this point here, right? Okay, I'm gonna stop it.
Yeah.
We're gonna take this to the list for official results, okay?
Confirm it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike and Brian. Okay,
We are not.
well, okay, who's next? Peter. You're gonna talk about transaction token, right?
Yeah.
Transaction token. Okay. Let me hand you that slide thing. Yes, Yep.
Okay,
you drive.
I drive
You
transaction
have-
tokens and go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
15 minutes.
15 minutes.
Yeah.
I'll talk really fast. This won't take all of 15 minutes. So quick update on where we are with transaction tokens. So I'm Peter Castleman. My fellow editors, authors, Atul and George. I if they're online, please chime in if I say things that's not entirely true or accurate. So a little bit of background on
Come on.
transaction tokens. Come on.
It's with you. Huh?
Take the other sticker. See what it actually brings.
There you go. Yeah, probably the battery.
Thank you. Okay, so just a quick recap for folks who may be new to the topic of transaction tokens. It's really, a transaction token is really a token that is internal to a given trust boundary. The goal for it is really to be used to capture some context about the transaction and progress that forward, and sort of prevents people from this habit of maybe passing along access tokens. So one of the big use cases is I get an access token, I exchange it for a transaction token. My transaction token can be passed around through multiple internal microservices. If that token gets compromised, no big deal. It cannot be replayed. It has a very short lifetime, and you cannot re-enter at the front door with that. It also allows you to sort of bind transaction details, authorization details, and the subject. So one of the trends that we see is, when you want to make an authorization decision, you want to know who initiated the request. You need a bit of information about the original context, some of the authorization details, and so all of this is available in the in this transaction token. One of the other things that it's useful for is also for sort of downscoping at transactions at the edge, right? So an access token may come in with very broad access or a scope that's quite wide, but in reality, I only want to do maybe a very small transaction, or I want to take a very specific action. And so the transaction token actually is an opportunity to also do some of that downscoping. And then we can do this finer grained authorization. The picture there, I like pictures, so you sort of get the idea. Access token in, exchange for a transaction token, and then you can pass it along. There's also a mode where any of these internal microservices can re-request a transaction token if they need another one. Some architectures do require that, and actually I've been told to implement it. But we allow for flexibility, and it's not mandatory. It is an option for people who need to do that. Okay, so since draft 04, mostly at this point we're doing text clarifications, non-normative things, so trying to clarify, remove editorial things, being consistent about capitalization. We talked a little bit about how transaction token discovery should happen, or at least it maybe should not happen. Some guidance on key rotation, again, mostly sort of referring to say, well, you have to rotate your keys, but that's not something that we are going to be overly specifying in this draft. One normative change is the introduction of the TCTX, the transaction context claim, and that's really just renaming what previously was known as the AZD claim, which I believe was something that had sort of came from RAR originally, but we ended up for a different claim name. So just to avoid confusion and allow for other types of claims to be included. At the interim call, the main topic of discussion was what about batch processing? So one of the things about these transaction tokens is they're meant to be short-lived. One of the realities of these microservice architectures is sometimes you end up doing batch processing. That batch processing may run for a very long time. The transaction token might expire, etc. And so we sort of had a discussion about whether we need to do anything specific to try and enable batch processing. At the interim, the feedback was very strong and definitive that should be out of scope for the specification. So we're not specifically introducing any batch processing modes at this time. The idea there is also that we will get some more actual experience with transaction tokens in batch processing mode before we start trying to define how what's going to work best in those modes. Couple of known implementations. So we believe in Keycloak, as well as there is a new open source implementation, Tokenides, which is now an official Cloud Native Compute Foundation project. So people can go and download Tokenides and deploy it in their Kubernetes clusters, and now they have access to transaction tokens. So discussion point that came up in a discussion at the OAuth security workshop was, what about transaction token lifetime? So currently, in our current the current language that we use, when we originally wrote this, we were careful about allowing transaction tokens to acquire more scope than, say, the access token originally. And so one of those scope aspects was time. And so when we first wrote it, we said, well, a transaction token should not exceed the lifetime of an access token, so that you don't go from maybe an hour length access token to a 5-hour length transaction token or something like that. But at the same time, it turns out that's not necessarily reasonable, because you can have a fairly short-lived access token. And then what that really means is that is the period during which the access token can be presented or will be accepted. But it's not really fair or correct to assume that that actually says how long the process will take to complete, right? The access token doesn't have to be valid when the request completes. It just has to be valid when the request starts. And so one of the proposals is to relax that language. And so the question here is really to get some feedback around when it would be okay for the transaction token to live beyond the lifetime of the access token. Is that do people agree that that is something that we should allow? Or whether that sort of strict binding should be maintained. From the author's perspective, we believe it should be relaxed, but we would like to hear from others as well. I see we've got folks in the queue, so maybe I'll
It's up to you. Do you have more open issues?
No, that is
Okay,
the
that's
only
the
thing
only
that I
one. Okay.
wanted to get
Perfect.
feedback from
Okay.
the group on.
Perfect. Aaron.
Aaron.
It's like a whole journey to get back here. Hi, Aaron Parecki. It does make me nervous to open up this, to relax this language, because I feel like it is a very slippery slope to just completely ignoring the whole concept of access token lifetime at that point. What I usually tell people is that when they're designing things like this, whether or not they're using this spec, it's less important about in your microservice chaining about when the token expires, and it's more important to determine whether the token was valid when the entire process chain started. So if you have something that has been processing and has taken 5 minutes before it finally sends the email, as long as the thing that's sending the email can check that the access token that started the initial call chain was valid at the time the call chain started, then it's okay. And that's a slightly different definition than extending or working beyond the lifetime of the access token.
I love that. That's a great insight. And so maybe there's a way in which you can preserve the information about when the transaction started and use that as in this. This is good. Thanks, Aaron.
Yeah.
appreciate that. That's a good way to.
Yeah, I would try that is to find a way to preserve the timestamp that the transaction started throughout the entire chain, and then that can be used to evaluate this.
That's excellent suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, I see the chat also. Brian agrees with Aaron. Justin.
Hi, Justin Richer. And yeah, agree with what Aaron said. And to take that a step further, the lifetime of the transaction token should not really be the controller for the lifetime of the transaction, right? Because really what you're trying to say when you're asking about, is this transaction token valid, is it in a context where it makes sense for this to be processing right now? And anytime you're trying to capture that inside a transaction token, you're really only saying this transaction should at most take 5 minutes to run. And if it goes beyond that, then something probably fell over and you should throw it out anyway and things are weird. The other bit of that, and I think that this is really important to capture, at a very similar thought to what Aaron was saying, it's important to capture initiation as the key point here. because in addition to this question of lifetimes, it also needs to be very clear that the transaction token must not be used to initiate a new transaction in the same way that an access token does. The current draft goes a good amount of the way to getting there, but I think framing it in terms of initiation, validity at start, all of that kind of stuff, as opposed to lifetime of the token itself, I think is a much better way to do the security reasoning, a much more realistic way to do the enforcement, because you're going to have some like, orchestrator that says like, this thread is running too long and nothing came back, I'm killing it. Like, that's how you're going to expire something in the real world, right? It's very unlikely that you're going to have a legitimate scenario where you really need this to have a long lifetime that's not being enforced elsewhere somewhere, right?
Thank you, Justin. Appreciate that. George.
Yeah, just one. Dean also agrees with Aaron and Justin. So just to,
Yeah,
and George.
just speaking for the authors, Aaron, I think that was the general intention, right? Is that right now, if you got an access token that was going to expire in 2 seconds or in 30 seconds, and but it is still valid for initiating the transaction, then, and the transaction token lives for 3 minutes, right? Then it would continue beyond the lifetime of the access token. And saying that the transaction token can only live for 30 seconds doesn't make sense. So I think there probably is better wording we can put in there around that to capture that concept, but that was the general intention. Was more to just cover that small window where you want the transaction to complete because it's authorized. The authorization for it is valid at initiation time, and they're short-lived anyway.
Thanks, George. Rohan.
Hi, Rowan May. So I like what Justin said about the expiration times. I just want to caution that the one thing that you still want to check, even if it was okay, it was valid back then, is revocation or status list stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Rohan. I close the queue, but I want to give Arndt a chance, and Dean also, very quickly. Arndt, go ahead.
Yeah, I fear that if we bind these lifetimes, we make access tokens longer valid than they need to be. So for example, if I have a transaction that runs for 30 minutes in my internal environment and I bind those lifetimes, I actually have to make the access token valid for 30 minutes, even though I could know I only need it valid for 30 seconds.
Yeah, that's a great point. I can see people making that choice to get around some kind of restriction that we put on lifetime. Thanks, Arndt.
Dean.
Hi, Dean Sachs. Whoa, that's hot. So I just want to reiterate what I said in the chat and what Aaron and Atul were saying as well, is that we need to carry forward when the access token was actually presented. In the initial transaction token generated, that is the IAT claim. It's the issued at time. But you can actually create another transaction token from a transaction token. So we would need to carry forward the entire chain of when the access token was valid until when the initial transaction token was issued, and carry that all the way down the chain if we're going to keep that context to ensure that the transaction started when the access token was valid. So we'll take this to the list probably.
Yeah.
Dean, just to clarify, Dean, that section 7.5.1 actually says that the replacement transaction token should not, or must not exceed the initial transaction token. So that particular instance is not going to happen.
Okay, I'll need to go read that, Atul. Thanks.
Thanks, Dean. Okay. Peter.
Thank you, everybody.
No, wrap it up and.
Okay, so I think as the next step, great input. What we'll do is we'll prepare a PR and maybe request some review on that before we merge it. I think the final thing is, this is probably the last big thing. And so a question is, we would like to, we want to get ready for working group last call. So once this is merged, some reviews of the specs from the working group and maybe get some feedback and go on to working group last call.
Right. So this is the only thing that is open, right?
Yeah, this is the last thing that we have.
Okay, perfect. Yeah,
Right.
sounds good. Let's close this one, issue a new version, and we'll start our work group last call.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. Who's next? Brian. Yeah, we stuck with him. So is that token exchange? No, what is it that you're chaining? Ah, I see. Chaining. Uh-oh. Thomas Chan. This one. Yeah. There you go. Okay. Okay. So you have 15 minutes.
15. Are we behind?
Are we 50? 20. Yeah, I think we're good. We're good. Yeah.
You all get to see me again here up on Friday. So for a number of meetings leading into it, I politely requested to avoid Fridays. And I think as retaliation for that historical conduct, I've been relegated to multiple presentations here on Friday. So apologies and thank you, Rafat. I am here now to talk about OAuth, identity and authorization chaining across domains, on behalf of myself and a large number of co-authors, many of whom I hope are with us remotely. So,
Or is it? Yeah, it's annoying.
There we go. Okay, so the general flow here is describing a mechanism or a common pattern that preserves identity and authorization information across trust domains that use OAuth. This is actually the JWT authorization grant piece of the stuff we were talking about earlier, facilitating that cross-domain acquisition of an access token based on a signed authorization grant from one trust domain to another. And really, there's this pattern that is maybe not well understood or widely deployed, but certainly recurring, and was largely the intent of combining these two different existing specifications we have. One is the OAuth 2 token exchange, the other is the JWT authorization grant, where there's some kind of local exchange that occurs via token exchange, done with some sort of probably internal authority, possibly a local authorization server, where you take something you have, the client takes something it has, and exchanges that for a JOT suitable to facilitate this cross-domain acquisition of an access token using the JWT authorization grant. And I tried to lay this out visually here, showing it the two different sort of trust domains occurring with the colors of the Thai flag, sort of. But the idea, again, is you have some client, could be a number of different things acting in a role in this first trust domain. Sometimes it's a resource server, sometimes an independent client. It has something, it's some kind of token, some credentials of its own. It's out of scope for this stuff. But it takes that thing, calls the local authorization server using token exchange and says, give me a JOT that I can use to make this cross-domain JWT authorization grant call. it gets that back and then makes the cross-domain call using this defined interface for cross-domain browserless, headless authorization, and gets back an access token. That's the main flow. Both of these specs exist. This spec itself is really just trying to codify and describe the pattern because it's something that comes up a lot, but is oftentimes missed or misunderstood, or people try to do similar things in different ways. So this spec is, for the most part, trying to just bring some clarity and codification to this pattern, not introduce new functionality necessarily. So it was first introduced back in San Francisco. Peter talked about it, the general idea. I think it was adopted after that. Peter tried to bring additional clarity to the concept itself in Prague. In Brisbane, Kelly first started talking about the idea of introducing sender-constrained key-bound tokens to this flow. And it turns out that is a complicated subject to talk about, especially in the context of these already fairly complicated topics. At some level, they're not really that complicated, but there's so many variations and different ways to think about and do things. It is pretty complicated, and the idea of sender-constraining tokens layered on top of this just further complicated and confused the conversation, both for the general working group as well as, frankly, the specification authors themselves. Following that, in IETF in Vancouver, I tried to not bring clarity to the complication, but really just describe the ways in which I anticipated it would, in fact, be very complicated. This was also the meeting that I was having a really hard time with my calendar and scheduling on, and showed up very late and was made to do calisthenics at the front of the class by Rafat. I'm not sure if that's a violation of some sort of IETF policy. We'll check with the ADs, but it happened. Anyway, really, the only thing that came out of that was me trying to convey, in fact, it is complicated. And I think we already all knew it was complicated, but it was really then just, maybe admitting that it's complicated. So at 121, Kelly spoke and tried to convey some of the thinking in the behind the scenes. We'd been talking about this, trying to get to a point where we could sort of clarify and include some meaningful content in it. We had several PRs that came and went, were requested changes, were deleted, a new one came in. And Kelly did talk about the general concept here. I think the net result of this is that people were even more confused than when we started it, unfortunately, because again, it is a rather complicated topic, both the wire protocol as well as the trust mechanisms and the implications involved in it. It's just unfortunate in that it is confusing, and we were all very confused. There was also an interim on the topic where Peter tried to bring some clarity, and I'm not sure how he did there either, other than confusing us, or at least me. I think we were all still very confused, although I did get a nice picture of Peter here at OSW being very contemplative. The outcome of that meeting, I'm not sure was very helpful, other than further realization that it is in fact complicated and we needed to do something to reduce the confusion and move forward. And with that, I am proud to say, I think that we have come to a place where, at least in terms of agreement among the authors and co-authors of this specification, we've reached a bit of clarity and simplification around how we can sort of put this one vexing issue behind us and try to move forward. And that is, in a single non-normative section of the document, we provide non-normative guidance around what it would mean to convey, in a particular context, the need to request a sender-constrained or key-bound token when making the cross-domain call in contexts where the caller doesn't necessarily have the private key material associated with the key that's being requested to bind the token to. It's still complicated. It's still confusing. It still has potential trust implications for your deployment, but we've more or less kicked the can to the side of the road or down the road. I think of it as the side so we can move forward by giving a really nice articulate description of the problem, how one might go about addressing it in a specific deployment that needs it, recommends but does not standardize even a claim name about how you might do that, but doesn't do anything more. So it's not normative, it's descriptive, it's meant to be helpful, but not a requirement, and hopefully allows us and the general working group as a whole to move forward without specifically solving the problem, but also giving it a nod, admitting that there are issues here and trying to describe what could be done in deployments that actually need this. The text is obviously too small to read, but this is a diff from the document. Yes, sir.
One thing that, at least from a solution point of view, that looked obvious to me, which maybe it's not usable in this context, but was, since this borrows a lot conceptually from Kerberos, at least from the message exchanges, not from the encoding of the payloads, was to also recycle the mechanism used in Kerberos, because we know that it works. We know how, obviously, it's well documented, like it has been in use for like 30 years or so, not maybe longer, probably much longer. So it looked like a tempting approach, to me at least.
I'm admittedly not super familiar with the details of Kerberos or specifically the Kerberos pattern that would apply to this.
Okay. So maybe I should post the mail to the list.
If there's a specific pointer that you think would be helpful,
there's good pointers. Yep.
That like regular people could understand. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'd be interested in seeing that. Okay, thank you. That was supposed to be a joke. This kind of a play on words. Oh no, I wish. It was what, Aaron, or what, Arun? Anyway, there is trying to build on that. Like this document itself is meaning to bring some clarity to a space that folks have struggled with in various ways over time. Aaron has written basically a profile of this draft for a specific use case that's valid, and they're working on deployments. But what I really wanted to say here, that's the name of it, a picture of him. But the point here is that this document, trying to bring sort of clarity to people that might be looking to accomplish similar use cases, is in fact doing what it's supposed to do, because as Aaron reports, he was sort of experimenting with other ways to accomplish sort of the same things, and came across this document and realized that it was more or less a better fit for what he was trying to accomplish, and in turn took his work and I don't know if retrofitted is the right word, but more or less adjusted it such that it would be a proper profile of this pattern. And that to me is a good sign in that it's addressing its needs. We had some conversations earlier this week, just in general, which suggested to me that it's still not particularly well known and understood. And I do think that's unfortunate. It underlies that there's a need for something like this, but also that it's not known as well as we might like, and I don't know what to do about that exactly, but I do think this is confirming that it is valuable and important work.
So,
I'm almost done.
Okay.
No,
Yeah, just finish.
These are words I said at various points over the last few times when various authors have stood up here and said something like, we think we're ready for working group last call. I sort of tongue-in-cheek said, yeah, and that's not. So I am not going to make the same mistake here. I don't think we're there yet, but I do think that that we're moving in the right direction. This is an important simplification and milestone, but we've got work to do, and I'm not going to get ahead of ourselves.
Thank you, Brian. That's great. So I would like to get volunteers for a few people to review this and see if whatever these guys made makes sense. So Dean is raised his hand. 2, Justin, thank you.
Thank you, Justin.
One more,
Thank you, Dean.
please. Joe, thank you.
Ooh.
Awesome. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're done with Brian today. Relax. Okay. And that would be, where is it? Hold on, let me hand you that thing.
All right. Well, I'm actually going to hand over to my co-author, Brian, for this next presentation.
Oh, come on, stop it.
No, it was great. So, hi, everybody. So you remember that can that Brian said that we kicked to the side of the road? Here's the can. Genuinely, I think we should talk about, we as a working group need to focus on this topic, because this is the kind of thing, it keeps coming up, it keeps being brought to light, and we keep saying, maybe we'll deal with that later. And I've generally, deferred key binding for OAuth tokens. I think it's named something similarly in the appendix of the chaining draft. But really what this is about is one component saying to another, like, hey, trust me, bro, this is going to be fine. Right? So what do I mean by that? First, mostly for the symbols that I'm using, public key cryptography is what we're generally going to be talking about here. And when a public key and a private key love each other very much, they can make a proof. And you need both parts in order for that to happen. So anyway, the way that we think about regular binding a token to a key is that I can I give you the proof of the fact that I have the private key of that key pair. I can create a proof, and I say, give me a token that is tied to this key. So I'm giving you the public key and a proof related to that key pair at the same time. And this works out pretty well because I can get a token that's wrapped up to that. The auth server actually has a copy of that key because it's public. It can do that. That all works just fine. And then, of course, the client can present a proof based on that same public key with that token back to the RS, and then the RS can do whatever lookup it needs to get the key. We've got confirmation claims and introspection and all of this. All of this is pretty run-of-the-mill. So here's where things get weird. When I want to ask for a token or other artifact, but generally let's say access token here, that is bound to a key that I don't have. Now I can present you proof of a key that I do have, but it's not going to be the same key that I'm asking for the token to ultimately be bound to. And this breaks a lot of the assumptions that we were just talking about. Now, we can kind of cram the protocols together. If you squint at Depop hard enough, you can make it do this. It depends on how you define a key. Brian's giving me a funny look. I agree, it's real weird. You shouldn't do it that way. You kind of can. But importantly, it wasn't made to do that. OAuth MTLS was not made to do this. Like none of our sort of, token bound things were really quite made to work this way. But this is what we're asking to do. When we're talking about the cross-domain thing, when we're talking about a lot of workload authentication stuff in the Whimsy group, when we're talking about how do I tie something to a transaction token that's going to be presented by a bunch of different parties downstream. I want this to be tied to a set of workload keys. Well, I don't have the workload keys because I'm not the workload. I'm a gateway. Like, how do I make those statements in a way that actually makes sense? Well, this is really what's going on. The AS is like, okay, why on earth should I let you use this key that you can't prove that you have? And the client is saying, trust me, it's fine. It's going to be okay. Just tie it to this key. You know who I am. You know that I'm all right. So this is going to work out. Funny thing is, we already kind of do this in a lot of places in OAuth. When you're handing over a bearer token, what else are you doing but saying, trust me, Ra, I was supposed to have this token. If I didn't have the token, if I wasn't supposed to have the token, then I wouldn't have the token in the first place, right? That's a feature. And OAuth is full of assumptions like this. We do, over the last decade, we've gotten better at calling those out. And we've also, interestingly, been doing a lot of work to close down a lot of those gaps for use cases where we don't want this particular kind of behavior, right? So the desired result here is that I do get a token that's tied to the key that I don't have, and I can't use it. Like, that's the desired result, which is really weird for OAuth to do, to give me a token that I actually can't present. It does work that the person who does have the key can present the token, though, and that is the desired result. So an intermediary can request something, or on behalf of, as a service, or some relationship there that we as a community have done a poor job of defining, can get the token over there so that it can actually be used in that context. There's a bunch of reasons that this could be bad. There's a whole class of attacks about somebody posing as an authorization server in order to get a token bound to their security context, but somebody else's key and account, right? So in the GNAP RFC, this is one of the security considerations. Some researchers wrote up a whole paper on this. I know that there's been some work out of researchers at OSW for similar attacks in the OAuth space. Like, the core of the AS mix-up attack is basically this, but with bearer tokens. And it turns out that even if you're doing sender constrained tokens, if you're not careful, if you are willing to trust me, brah, then you're susceptible to a lot of the same things. So there's reasons that this could be bad, but there are also reasons that we actually want to do this. Because this very simple diagram illustrates, we have all of these use cases where we want to pass a token or some other artifact along and say, you know what, I also want to get in on that chain, and I want to be associated with this so that I can present that artifact somewhere else down the chain and prove that it was me that did it. Right, so I can give you proof of key 3, but I actually can't give you proof of key 2.
Remote people might not be able to see that, so you might want to be kind of more descriptive. Like,
yeah, I know. Okay, let's get in there.
Okay, just
I forgot what I was saying, so I'm going to start over at this slide again. Thank you, Rafat. Okay, trust me. In this very simple diagram, as we can see, RS1 is asking to be able to present a token that it had received from client 2. Now, that token, as we saw on the previous slide, or a previous slide, was originally bound to client 2's proof key, which RS1 does not have by design, but it has its own key. So this is a token that previously exists in the world, and this now wants to be kind of read into that security envelope in order to be able to partake in what that token can do and what that token can represent. This is a very common, workload chain cross-domainy type of thing that we want to do. And there are aspects of this that are in the identity chaining document. And that's not the only place it's come up. Like, this keeps coming up in different ways. And then things get extra weird when you start talking about the fact that these can go across different security domains. Because AS2 might not have any idea about the public key that the token was initially issued to, but if it's a bound assertion and not a token, then the same kind of presentation mechanics actually apply here. Like, I want to be able to carry this assertion and prove that maybe I'm the one that was supposed to receive it, and therefore I can present it in a limited context, but not as the original presenter. That's a very reasonable thing to be able to do. So what do we do about it? This has been coming up in conversations for a very, very long time. I remember, I want to say we first waved it off when we were talking about MAC tokens back in the day. Mike might remember that. Yeah, I also. And every time it's come up, We've gotten very hand wavy as a community and said, you know what, have a policy, make it make sense. This is coming up more often now that we have good mechanisms for key bound access tokens. We have Depop and MTLS already out on the wire. I've proposed a mechanism that uses HTTP signatures. I think that that's a really compelling thing to do. We've got things in the Whimsy working group that are doing similar things with Whimsy identity tokens. We're going to have things that use transaction tokens that tie things together. And it's not the same as presenting an access token, but it's presenting a context in a cryptographically verifiable way. So I think we need to have this conversation now. But I don't know what the parts of the conversation are that we really need to have. And I definitely don't know what the answers are, because it's a different set of assumptions than what OAuth was originally built around. But OAuth as a working group left that behind a very long time ago. And so I think it is up to us as a community to really dive into this. Do we have a pattern? Are there parameters or something like that? We could at least document it at the very, very least. In the shadow of OSW and Kelly's presentation there, I wrote the very tongue-in-cheek, but still it has a point, trust me, brah claim draft linked here. And it goes over the basics of what this problem actually is. So I don't think we should adopt this draft. That would be very silly.
Yeah.
Or Hannes wants to start a new working group, so we can maybe do that. But I do think that we as a community need to address this problem head on. Again, I don't know what the result looks like, but I think we need to start talking about it now.
So, Justin, do you think an interim might be helpful?
Excuse me, an interim on this topic, I think would be a good idea. Specifically, one that is not also processing the identity chaining draft, even though it mentions it.
Dedicated.
I think
this.
dedicated just to this one small slice of deferred key bound access tokens and stuff.
Okay, sounds good. We can do that.
All right.
Thanks, Justin.
All right.
Okay, last presenter. Okay. Let me share my screen. Meanwhile, do you want to introduce yourself, Nick?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Nick Watson. I am from Google. I run the authorization server there for human accounts. And yeah, I'm a new participant here. I've got my scarlet letter to prove it.
Mm-hmm. So, what's the name of that thing? Of identity and authorization.
And
do you remember what's the name of the slide that you sent me? Token exchange.
Something. Yeah.
Is this one?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Perfect. Okay.
And does this?
I need to hand it to you. There you go. Yeah.
All right. Cool. So 2 topics today, error expressiveness and refresh token expiration when it comes to token endpoint responses. So a problem that we are observing today is that errors from the token endpoint are insufficiently expressive. We have a lot of error conditions that can cause exchange failures, and we don't have a good way to communicate them. Based on the error codes defined by the original spec, most of them are sort of coding configuration type errors that you wouldn't really expect to encounter at runtime, with basically everything else as invalid grant. So some examples of some of these errors are things like reauth or some kind of other step up auth, or something about the user account state has changed out from underneath, which would make the exchange not successful. Like, I don't know, for example, the user has been blocked from making YouTube comments because they were spamming, and so now we want to block YouTube exchanges, for example, something like that. So other reasons why we might want more error expressiveness is if we have to display a lot of this information to the user, which is not really something that we can do by returning information from the endpoint to the client. Right. So just a quick bit of numbers here. I don't think I'm giving away too many trade secrets. So we are rejecting hundreds of thousands of refresh token exchanges daily due to miscellaneous policy errors, things which are not covered by your standard invalid grant. And almost none of them result in reattempting an authorization flow where we could actually do something about it. So I've got a couple of possible solutions here. I have learned this week the best way to get people to comment on those is to make an internet draft, but I've just started this a couple weeks ago and I've not had time to write anything. So one of them would be adding another field that basically says do something like reattempt authorization, basically a stronger signal to the client that they should attempt to do the authorization flow again, as opposed to today where invalid grant could be for a number of reasons like user revocation, in which case you don't necessarily want to badger them again. So this is kind of nice. It's simple. It decouples expected client behavior from the actual error code. But it has a couple of issues where restarting a whole authorization flow to show an error is not necessarily a great user experience. And it also doesn't allow any sort of out-of-band resolution. It requires the user to be present and the client needs to restart a flow. So another one, this is something I'd actually posted to the list, and I even just yesterday when someone was talking about step-up auth with RAR sort of hinted at, which is can the authorization server actually return an entire URL or like big encoded parameter or something so that the client can basically initiate a new request or communicate this URL through some other channel like email in the case where the user is not present. So this is extremely flexible. As you might imagine, the authorization server can basically encode any information that it wants into this URL, which would allow it to do a recovery flow. Of course, it is the most complex. In many cases, the OAuth client is running in a sort of offline manner. It could be some kind of analytics script that somebody launched 100 years ago and no one has ever looked at again. And in those cases, it doesn't really do anything. I will actually take it to the queue now because
Okay.
Yeah.
Brian.
Just real quickly on this one, have you looked at the error URI, existing error URI parameter?
Yeah, so my understanding, at least as the documented, is the error URI parameter is that it is for developer documentation as a means to just say like, hey, you've got an invalid client, here's why, maybe, as opposed to some user interactable. So this was kind of intended to be the analog to that of something for the user to interact with as opposed to the developer.
Got it. Okay, thanks for clarifying. I will say that previously, having talked about the error URI parameter, I got a lot of pushback from security folks and IESG folks about the kind of problems that might introduce, where you would introduce someone to have to follow a URL or induce someone to follow a URL. So no thoughts on that other than FYI.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too familiar with the concerns around that. If you have anything I can read, that would be great. It might be also like, I would think it'd probably be equivalent if you could just, if the authorization server or resource server could just pass back like a blob, like here's a parameter, which I'll call authorization state, just some string, and then the client can make its own URL to the authorization endpoint with that extra parameter, would probably be just as good. The main point being that it gives the authorization server some mechanism to pass information through.
Brian, do you remember if that feedback was through ISG review or something that we could dig up or something? Okay. 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 No, that's fine. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, okay. Okay, that's fine. Keep going.
All right. Just for completeness here, I have included the solution 3, which is don't do anything, or rather leave everything as is, where this manifests basically where authorization server returns invalid grant for every error and relies on clients to restart an authorization flow based on that. I rechecked the description of invalid grant. It really is somewhat specific in the RFC, so it would need probably some expansion there to say that this includes cases where not only the grant is invalid, but also maybe something else happened and that needs corrective action. I don't particularly like this. I think it's philosophically the wrong thing to do. It aliases too many errors and prevents clients from handling them differently.
There's a comment from Ben. Ben, do you want to talk about that comment? Okay. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so Ben will reach out to you after that. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, keep going.
All right. So yeah, so that is basically the gist there. My intent after this, and certainly before IETF 1, 2, 3, is to probably write up an internet draft about the URL or maybe just blob a parameter that the authorization server can return to solicit feedback on that. Okay, so right, refresh token expiration. This is the second one. This is new topic, still token endpoint. So the first thing I'm going to call out is that there are two concepts. There is consent expiration and credential expiration. So consent expiration would be either a user or potentially authorization server or enforced constraint on how long a user consent is good for. So this could be for particularly sensitive data, like if the user is giving out access to their email inbox or like health data or something where they don't want to just give a consent and have it last forever. And also users are terrible at revocation. We have observed in practice that almost nobody revokes stuff. So being able to set a time up front, users can do this. Second concept, credential expiration. So this is the actual credential itself. Like if you're implementing rotation, maybe how often do you need to rotate the token before it would just expire on its own. So I've included here at the bottom, basically the credential is going to expire in the minimum value of these two. If you have a 7-day rotation cadence and a 30-day user consent, it's going to expire in 7 days and still expire in 7 days if it's a 7-day user consent and a 30-day rotation period. Right. So we have observed in practice from trying to roll some of this out that clients very much would like to know refresh token expiration time. So for consent expiration, what clients want to do is proactively remind the user that their consent is expiring. And this is so that the user can take steps to reconsent and increase the lifetime of the consent to avoid any sort of service interruption. You could imagine some, I don't know, fitness tracker that's tracking all your runs or whatever. And then if you forget, then you're going to lose a whole bunch of data. For refresh token rotation, this is one I'm less sure of whether clients specifically want to know this value at runtime or whether documentation from the authorization server would be good enough. I don't know if anyone implements a dynamic rotation schedule. But one thing to note is that if it's for rate limiting purposes, the authorization server could always ignore clients that are trying to rotate too fast by simply returning the same string if they're doing it every 100 microseconds or whatever, whatever. Let's see, hold on. Right. I think this is the last slide anyway, so let me just quickly get through this. So yeah, so if there's an authorization server that is implementing both refresh token rotation and also has consent expiration, then a single field of refresh token expiration might not be super helpful because the reasons that they want to know this information differ. Like if you have a 24-hour rotation cadence and the user has given consent for 30 days, you do not want to be bugging the user every 24 hours to please redo your consent, because that's incorrect. But as I've noted here, if rotation cadence can be addressed adequately by documentation, then maybe a single field is good enough. Or we could have, you could make two fields, like refresh token expires in and consent expires in, something like that. So, all right, Justin.
Hi, Justin Richer. Yeah, this is hard. The response of the token endpoint kind of smashes everything together into one big data structure, and it's really unclear what all of the fields actually apply to, because they're not divided very well. The problem with adding more fields and more semantics now is that people have made different assumptions about what each of those things means in various implementations. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying there be dragons, because I have worked on various implementations of OAuth ASs where in one, the refresh token is a field of the access token table. In another, there were two completely separate tables, and there was an end-to-one relationship between them. And then the grant management API and things like that add yet another layer on top of that, and that's managing the consent. Sometimes it's consent, and sometimes it's something other than consent that's being managed there. It's very, very messy how all of these things tie together. My worry would be that adding additional fields that clarify these things are inevitably going to conflict with somebody's reality. So we have to be very careful of this if, as a community, we decide to actually go and do this. I will also add, though, that there are some practical things that can be done. Like I helped implement an idempotent refresh token processor on a server, wherein if the same client sent the same refresh token with the same parameters, you would get back the same access token. If it sent it too fast, you would just get back the same access token. You wouldn't keep rotating the refresh token, because there is an assumption of idempotency that is actually not defined by OAuth at all. We could define that. Doing so would break people's assumptions about what it would actually mean, and thereby push things out of compliance that are considered to be compliant today because it's undefined. I don't think there's a clear answer for this, though.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that any spec to address this would certainly have to come with I don't know, like a large glossary or something where everyone has to agree on what certain terms mean, like what is the difference between a consent duration and, say, like a session duration or something like that. Aaron?
Hi, Aaron Parecki. So one quick thing before the main point I want to make, you asked about refresh token rotation, and there are absolutely dynamic refresh token rotation systems where it'll like extend out the expiration if it's used, but if it's not used in 7 days, it'll expire, things like that. So rotation does not mean fixed schedule at all. So the main thing I wanted to say was I appreciate that you're bringing this here with the perspective of like actual user visible things as the core. Like, I think it's very easy to get into the weeds of talking about the mechanics of token rotations and revocations and blah, 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 which I usually say it doesn't matter for the most part. And like everyone makes different decisions and implements things slightly differently. But your goal, if I understand correctly, is that like you want to allow the client to let the user do something that is not possible to do with the current mechanisms that are in OAuth today. Right. So I think if we focus on that, we can be very specific about what we're defining that lets you do that without getting into the weeds of all the other slightly different semantics of the different properties. So if we just focus on like, okay, how do we let the client show that the user is going to be, logged out if they don't do something by a date, then let's tackle that. Because I 100% agree that's a problem. And just for the record, I used to say that the client has nothing different they can do if they know about the refresh token rotation or refresh token expiration, which is true except for the consent part. And it's the consent part that changes that. So yeah, it does let the client do something different if it knows when the consent will expire.
Yep.
Darren, thanks for
Hey, this is Darren McAdams. I just wanted to express interest in this topic as well. Here in AWS, we have actually had to implement a similar capability internally. Just really quickly, it was a OAuth being used for network tunneling on a personal laptop. And when the tokens expired, it would tear down all their tunnels. They'd lose all their sessions. Very impactful. So we actually just had to figure a way to do this. But if there's a standard way, very interested.
Oh yeah, I definitely empathize with that whole like OAuth token disappears, a whole bunch of stuff falls down because that's how somebody built it.
Jonathan Hoyland, Cloudflare. Your proposal 2 just sounds like there'll be a lot of issues with cross-site request forgery and server-side request forgery like attacks, and it would be just that you just have to make sure you don't put anything too crazy in there.
Yeah, just for everyone else, that's the one with the error URL being returned from the token endpoint.
You just don't want users like, oh yes, I'm going to redirect you to an arbitrary URL.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the sort of naive thing as I had written definitely implies some sort of trust relationship to the authorization server, that it wouldn't give you a malicious URL and that your connection wasn't intercepted or met in the middle by something else. But yeah, I think similar functionality could probably be achieved through different mechanisms, like just a single encoded parameter, and then let the client make its own URL, probably.
Okay, Ben.
Yeah, first, thank you for working on this, Nick. You're hitting a spot that I've been hitting as well. I'm implementing a mail client. Been working on Thunderbird in the past, and now my own. So this is perspective. I have a public mail client that works with any provider, and this is a big problem that I'm having by authenticating. I need to know why the authentication is failing, because I will recover in different ways. If the user entered the wrong password, I will let him try again. But if the user is blocked, then I will not do that. And if my client is blocked, then I need to know about this, because I need to take action. And currently I cannot differentiate whether all my users are entering wrong passwords, or whether there's a problem with my client because my client is being blocked. So I need to differentiate between all the different error cases. So you're addressing a problem that is very real. I would be happy to work with you on that. A question, do you think that more error codes would help? Because that would help. That was my obvious solution, that currently I just get access denied or invalid grant or things like that. If we add more error codes where they're more specific as one component so that the computer can read it. And the second component would be that to have a descriptive error message that is specifically for the end user. So the server constructs a string that the client can send to the show to the user, but the error code is the one that would help me as a client to decide how to proceed.
Yeah, I think probably having at least one more error code would be useful. I wouldn't want to necessarily try to define all possible things that could happen. I mean, I was noticing, I think that access denied is actually not a permitted error code on the token endpoint, which I think it should be. It seems an easy enough fix. But there's also I had on one of the slides, but I kind of skipped over it, there may be cases where the authorization server doesn't want to let the client know why it's blocking the user and wants to just tell the user. This could be like, for example, I had my example here was if they're maybe like, we have found out after the fact that they are a child, for example. And we want to pop something up saying, hey, you're a kid, go get your parent to do something or something like that. And we don't want to return a message to the client like, oh, this is a child. That's why. Yeah.
Yes, I understand. But if you're happy to work on that, in the chat, there's my email address. Feel free to reach out on my. I'd be happy to work with you on that if you want to.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Anything else? Anybody else?
Yeah, just one quick note, because the note that you just made, it made me realize that this is opening up a can of worms. In which case, in which there is a reason why we don't hand off client information that is intended for the user, because we don't want the client to know anything about the user, unless for example, if the access was revoked. So we need to tread lightly about not exposing information to the client about the user without the user actually agreeing with handing off that information.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there are solutions that we can do here that would keep that private.
Awesome. So I think you got lots of good feedback, lots of people
Yep.
interested. So yeah, work offline with those guys and submit a draft, and let's talk about this next time.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Nick. Okay. Thank you all. We're done. Yeah. Did you wake up now? And see you in Madrid, hopefully. That's fine. A few minutes. When are you heading home? Tomorrow? You have lunch, people?